My name's Darryl Gray. I'm the proud owner of this 1912 Renault. It was originally, when I purchased it, simply a pile of parts in a trailer. I'd had a bit of a passion for veteran cars for quite a lot of years, but particularly after I restored a 1926 Morris between 2005 and 2010. And after that, having finished that job, had nothing to do and thought, here's an opportunity, let's go and look for a veteran. Not being in a position to be able to afford to buy a veteran, the only option for me was to go through the process of putting one back together, similar to what I did with the little Morris. So in the case of this car, I purchased it in 2011, and it was simply a pile of parts that we brought back to Adelaide in a trailer. A lot of it had been in a fire. Thankfully the radiator, which we'll have a look at in a minute, plus the engine, the gearbox and the differential had been removed from the vehicle and stored in a shed somewhere. But the chassis, the bodywork, the wheels, the springs had all been left out in the weather, and there was a huge bushfire at some stage on this property in Victoria, and unfortunately it was all caught in the fire. As a direct consequence of that, a lot of the brass and bronze fittings had melted. The fire was obviously pretty hot, and there was a fair bit of work to do to restore the vehicle and get it back to the point where at least we could get the mechanicals together. We brought the parts home on the trailer and assembled them loosely on the front lawn just to see what was missing, and effectively it was pretty much complete, except there was no ignition system, no magneto or any distributor, and there was no fuel system. Otherwise, most of the car was there. If it wasn't there, there were bits that could be either substituted or we could make new ones. So the process began with the stripping of all of the material down. Because the car had been heated so hot, the paint had actually bonded with the iron, and it had to be ground off because it was fairly lumpy in a few places. There was quite a lot of rust, as you can imagine, and a lot of the parts had to be completely replaced because they were so badly damaged. So the first process was put the chassis back together, and I had that welded up and reinforced. There are a couple of bullet holes in it. I've been out in the bush probably for 70 odd years. And then we gradually worked through restoring the engine. Didn't need a great deal of work on the engine. I was told that it had sufficient compression to run effectively once I got the ignition system sorted out. So put the engine back together, put some new valves in it just to improve it a little, but the original cylinders and rings were in good shape, or good enough for the job. We then went along the process of the cooling system, the gearbox, the differential, everything was stripped down and put back together, but with a fair bit of maintenance required in the meantime. Had to make a few other parts. I took out all the bearings that were in the car and replaced the bearings except the engine bearings. So the wheel bearings and the differential bearings and what have you were all available off the shelf, surprisingly enough, 100 years later, and replaced all of those. So we got the mechanicals to the point where by 2013 I was able to drive the car, 2013, yes, able to drive the car on the road, not legally of course, but at least had the rolling chassis running. The next step of course was to go through the process of building the body for the vehicle, and I chose a body style that was the type that was available at the time. It was a little bit old-fashioned in 1912 to have what is called the Ras de Belge body. But a lot of the cars had the straight, smooth lines and the seats all level with the side of the vehicle, more like a modern vehicle. But this particular style of body appealed to me, and I figured it wouldn't be all that hard to build a body of that shape. We had a few issues with mechanical matters. The shafts that joined the engine to the gearbox had been, one of the universal joints on that shaft had been welded solid, so they had to be stripped down and rebuilt. As well, the clutch ring had been broken in a few places and somebody had tried to weld it, but without success. So there were a few mechanical issues that had to be dealt with. The springs had to be sent off to Adelaide Spring Works for a complete recasting of them. They had to be heated up and retempered and reshaped because they'd all lost their shape and form. The wheels, the only part of the wheels that was usable were the centres, and because the spokes and the rims had so badly rusted that it was not appropriate or safe to use them, and certainly would have been a very expensive job to repair. So I ordered the new rims and the spokes from the UK, and then learnt about how to set up a wheel and how to actually lace it and get it all true, and that was quite a little challenge, but once you get it, well, like most things, once you've done it a couple of times, it's relatively straightforward. Anyway, as I say, we got the car on the road and it was all tickety-boo, and mechanically went up the hill without too much trouble, but got to the point where the next stage was to go through the bodywork. As I mentioned, there was no bodywork at all. The only part of the body that came with the car was the firewall, which is just the big timber board which sits behind the radiator. That was original, but the rest of the body was missing. So I was able to build the body to the point where it suited me. Being a bit taller than average, I need a bit more leg room than most people, so I could make the seat back far enough. Fuel tank, I had to get a fuel tank, and I used a tank from the Volkswagen and set that in underneath the front seat, which was custom for the time, with a gravity feed to the carburetor. And then it was a case of building the bodywork using drawings, photographs of other vehicles. I didn't have any plans to go from, but because I was in a position where I could readily access veteran vehicles at the Motor Museum, I could do some measurements, get some relative profiles, and on the basis of that was able to build up something that looked a little bit like a veteran car. The next step was things like running boards had to be built, the mudguards. I didn't have any metalwork experience. Building a mudguard is a little bit tricky, in as much as you've got to roll the edges and you've got to roll the little beads in the shapes there to give them the strength. And I hadn't had any experience with that, so I got a quote. In fact, I got several quotes for those, but that was going to cost me thousands of dollars, and that money wasn't available, so I ended up buying a beading machine which does the job of rolling those little shapes into the steel, and we made the mudguards ourselves, and when I'd finished I sold the beading machine, so the 4 mudguards cost me about $300 in the end, which wasn't a bad job. The upholstery was done by a very good friend of mine, who's Phil Spencer, who's a professional at that, does motor trimming and is very happy to do veteran cars. He also did the hood, so I only did the set up the structure for the hood and shaped all the bits of wood and bolted on all the brass fittings and the irons and what have you, but he actually cut and fitted all the fabric. The bonnet was the next one of the challenges. When I purchased the car, it came with a bonnet, but what had happened is that the fellow that owned it before me had inherited it from his uncle, and his uncle had been a farmer in Victoria, and between the wars, some stage in the 30s, he had purchased the car. Prior to that, all we know about the vehicle is that it was originally ordered in Brisbane through the Renault agents in Brisbane, and it was ordered with these wire wheels. Wire wheels are very unusual for veteran cars of this particular period. They were only invented 5 years or so before that, and they were more on English vehicles than they were on French ones. But the agent had organised a special order of these wheels and actually advertised the fact that he was offering Renault cars with wire wheels which were bigger than the average and gave them more ground clearance, and also they weren't made out of wood, which they thought was a positive thing for Queensland. Anyway, bottom line, when the vehicle came to David Graham, who was the previous owner before me, from his uncle's estate, he planned to restore it himself, and he'd bought from South Australia, as it happens, this was in Victoria, he bought from South Australia a radiator bonnet, engine bonnet. Unfortunately, the bonnet was the wrong size. It was far too long and high, made for a much larger Renault model. But the important thing is that these brass shaped flutes that are so characteristic of the Renault bonnet, one on either side, he was able to recover those and was able to rebuild the bonnet using the original pattern, but simply bringing it down in size so that it was the right size for the vehicle. So that was a job done by another very good friend of mine, and he did a particularly good job. The brass work, the windscreen, etc. was all again had to be rebuilt, had to be made up, and in most cases in the old days it would have been from brass castings, would have been used, but I've actually made these out of solid brass and cut them out, shaped them according to the profiles using patterns from other vehicles. The engine itself was, as I mentioned earlier, was in pretty good shape. It was complete, but it certainly was very dirty and didn't look at anything like that. And that needed a fair bit of cleaning up, and parts needed to be replaced. I had to rebuild this inlet manifold, this copper tube here, which carries the ignition wires. Had to have that shaped. A professional gave me a hand with that. But and the inlet manifold down here towards the carburetor similarly had to be fashioned so that it was effective and did the right thing. The ignition system is slightly different to the original car, but that's a technical issue. We won't bother going into that at this point. Far too complicated. For those that are not familiar with the vehicle, the Renaults, very early Renaults, this particular body type and style, the shape of the bonnet and the radiator behind it was very characteristic of the model, and I think it was only up until about the middle of the 20s, before, or even later, before Renault actually put the radiator in front of the engine. Having the radiator behind the engine has a few advantages in some respects. Some people didn't agree with it, but from the point of view of cooling, it's wonderful, because you can't have a radiator that big in front of the engine because you can't see where you're going because of all of the effectively blocks your view. You can have a much larger radiator if it's behind the motor. The only problem is, how do you get the air to run through it? In the case of them, they have all built on a similar structure, which is a large number, in fact 1,000 of those copper tubes, vertical copper tubes, 10 rows, 100 across and 10 rows deep, and they join the top and bottom tanks. The principle behind the cooling is that the air runs in through those tubes and can't get out because the back has got a solid panel behind it, so it has to come back through under in the bonnet. If we just show you the bonnet, it comes back out of the front of the radiator at this point and then goes back through, past through the engine compartment, and then you can see there, if your light's good enough, there's a fan down at the bottom, right round on the side there, and that actually draws the air through the radiator, through the engine compartment, and back out and under the seat and under the car and off. So the engine then has to be completely sealed. So there are shrouds right across the chassis underneath, completely sealing the engine compartment, so that the only air that can get in must go through the side of the radiator, past all of those 1,000 tubes, past the engine, and then back out through the fan at the back. It has also the advantage that there are no fan belts. The fan is actually on the back of the flywheel, which is at the back of the engine. Moving on to other issues. Yes, I've purchased, and you still can buy from dealers, the original lights. So these are genuine Gisellier French headlights. They were and are still operable as acetylene lights as per the period. The acetylene gas is generated in the little generator which is on the side of the running board, and that is the acetylene gas is created by mixing water with the calcium carbide. That gas then is piped up through the little rubber tubes to the burners, and if you're on a night run, you would simply get everything organised, fire up your generator, put the carbide in, put the water on top of it, release the valve and quickly run up to the front, undo the valve at the back of the light and put your match in there and set a light to your acetylene light. So you get a very brilliant white light, quite effective in fact. Those cars that I've seen with the original lights still running, it does quite a good job. But for my convenience, for safety, difficulty of getting hold of calcium carbide and then having to store it away from water, we did a quick conversion and made it so that these lights run on LED. They're just little LED bulbs sitting on top of the burners. They can be taken off in a minute's notice, but that's from the point of view of convenience. You can press a button inside with a little battery. The other concession that I've made to modern motoring is having indicators and brake lights. So whereas this car would normally not have had any electricals at all, nothing at all, it's hand start, it's acetylene lights or kerosene lights. The little side lights up the top are run on kerosene, and similarly to the tail light. It had no need for electricals because there was no generator, no charging circuit, etc. And so as a consequence, it only had the one switch on the dashboard, and that was the switch which short circuits the magneto to stop the engine. Other than that, the dashboard was pretty plain, as you'll see. Mine's got a clock. Some of them had speedometers, but they weren't mandatory in 1912. So yes, it's pretty simple. This is the acetylene generator. Again, that's an original item made by Darryl in Paris in the early 1900s, 1912, but the latest. This is a double banger. This one is 2 cylinders here. Both of those take calcium carbide in solid form, and you simply fill it with water from that little container there. And once the water contacts the calcium carbide, it generates acetylene gas, and the gas immediately comes out. In this case, through the 2 taps here, so you can regulate the flow of the gas through those taps into this chamber, which is in fact a chamber just filled with horsehair. And the reason for that is to stop any small particles of the calcium carbide that get caught up in the bubbles that are created when the gas is being produced, and it stops them from going in and blocking the jets in the headlights. But the little horsehair filter there does that job, and then the acetylene gas goes through the little reddy-orange tubes and up to the headlights. When you've finished for the night, you simply turn the gas off, or turn these 2 taps off, and the pressure of the gas will stop the production of more acetylene. Then the trick is, at the end of, once you've packed the car away for the night, you remove the containers, take the remaining calcium carbide out and put it back into the container, which is normally stored under oil, as I understand, which keeps it from being in contact with water. Upholstery wise, Phil, as I said, did that nice job, but I simply gave him some photographs of a veteran car and the patterns, and asked him if I could have something similar to that, and he was very obliging and went overboard and did a spectacular job, I thought. Just start. I understand this year that there is the option available for people who have veteran cars who wish to start for a shorter run in the Beta Birdwood. Personally, I think that's a good idea, because I know there are a lot of people that are upset and put off by just the sheer volume of traffic lights, a number of traffic lights particularly that have grown up in the last 30 odd years. So that will provide an opportunity and hopefully encourage more people to enter their veterans in the Beta Birdwood. I understand that you can start from the Barrett Reserve still if you've got a veteran, but I think in my case I'll probably do the short run, because you get up there sooner and get a good spot in the grounds. This year I understand as well, we're going through the process for remembering Arthur Clizby. Arthur was one of the founders of the Beta Birdwood process, and one of the major players in the veteran and vintage car movement in South Australia. I gather he was responsible, in part at least, for the idea of the historic registration, which other states have since taken on. And as a consequence of that, the committee have decided to honour him and pay tribute to the work that he's provided and done on behalf of the committee. He passed away earlier this year, which was very sad, and they're going to actually go through the process of recognising him with banners and other materials to acknowledge his contribution that he made to the whole process.